Hello, I'm Nan Geschke, your host for the Los Altos History Show. Tonight we have Ward Winslow joining us. Welcome to the History Show, Ward.
Well, thank you, Nan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, well, thanks so much for coming. Ward is the editor of a recently published book on Silicon Valley entitled The Making of Silicon Valley, a 100-Year Renaissance. And that's what we're going to be talking to Ward about tonight. Ward is a longtime Peninsula journalist. He worked for the Palo Alto Times, which became the Peninsula Times Tribune. He also has written a history of Palo Alto called Palo Alto, a Centennial History, I believe. Is that
right?
Is that the correct title?
That's it.
Okay. Before we get started, what was entailed in being an editor? Were you both writer and editor, or managing editor? How did that all work?
Of the
book, yes.
The Making of Silicon Valley. Well, the reason I'm listed as editor is that I did not actually write everything in the book. I did write the 19 chronological chapters, which is sort of the running history of the valley, in our interpretation at any rate. But there are also some 60 company histories, almost 70 company histories in the book. And I did work on some of those, and I edited some of them, but I didn't actually originate all of them. And in fact, the companies had approval power over their own histories, so...
Good PR, huh?
So some of the PR people have had a little hand in there.
I see. So now you called this in your press release the first definitive history of Silicon Valley. What was the impetus for doing this kind of a job? Was it a long-time interest of yours?
Well, I didn't originate this project myself. John McLaughlin, who is the president of the publisher, which is the Santa Clara Valley Historical Association, thought up the idea, and he originally got sponsorship for it by making a couple of short videotapes, one of which he showed to the Palo Alto Historical Association. I happened to be on the board of that group at that time, and so I was interested in what they were trying to do, and later he recruited me as a writer for the book portion of the project. I should say that there's another part of this project which hasn't actually come to total fruition yet. That's a videotape which will be issued later in the year, probably running a couple of hours. It should be very good because it's based on interviews with some 60 of the Valley's company founders, top scientists, CEOs, gurus, and so on.
Oh, that sounds exciting. Yeah. And Walter Cronkite is
Walter Cronkite is the narrator for that.
Oh, that's quite a coup for you, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's neat. That's great. Well, you know, we live in the middle of Silicon Valley, and most of us are a little bit savvy about, you know, what's going on in the valley. But I thought tonight we would really sort of, you know, go back in time and try to figure out exactly why it happened here. And that's my first question to you, Ward, tonight. Why did it happen here? Why didn't it happen on the East Coast, for example, in Boston or New York? There's a reason for that, I think.
Yes, there are several reasons that might be mentioned. To begin with, the weather's nice here. I was reading one of the interviews today, and someone pointed out that his wife didn't like it in the cold, and he didn't like it hot. and here they were both reasonably satisfied. But far more than that, there's quite a history on the San Francisco Peninsula of radio development, tube development, and that was part of why there was a community here, at least a technical community and a manufacturing community. It wasn't very big at first, but it grew. That's part of it. The
Stanford
University was a big influence right from the beginning, and then...
Why was that?
Well, when Leland Stanford founded the university, he had been the president of the Southern Pacific Railroad, and he felt that many of the job applicants who came to him educated in the East might be able to speak Latin or Greek or discuss learnedly literature and so on, but they weren't really equipped to do a workaday job. So he wanted Stanford's graduates to be educated so that they would be directly useful in life as well as educated people. And that carried through, and he also emphasized science and technology,
yes,
which was sometimes kind of a second-class subject in the Eastern universities at that time. The Stanford's emphasis on this carried right through to the faculty, and the faculty people went out and worked with industry. They consulted. They took students out into the field.
So it's much more practical than in its
That's true,
in its thrust.
And you need to remember too that the West was still fairly sparsely settled at that time. That was 1891 when Stanford opened.
Yes.
So the industry and developing science and so on needed the university's expertise.
Yeah. So the ground was fertile here then,
Yes.
Ward, for all this to happen. Now, before we go on any further in terms of what happened chronologically, I'm intrigued by the 100-Year Renaissance subtitle of the book, and was this your idea, and what does that mean?
This was John McLaughlin's idea, but I certainly,
all his fault.
certainly bought into it. His introduction to the book discusses this in detail. He draws parallels between the two periods in the sense of there having been a real change that occurred in the case of the European Renaissance, partly because of the Black Plague, which changed the economics and sort of shook up society, turned things around quite a bit. Of course, it led to a great flowering it threw people into a different situation, and their response to it was part of what caused the great flowering of the arts. Michelangelo, who's on our cover,
yes.
Leonardo da Vinci, and the whole string of the arts people, and also the explorers who found the New World.
Right, in the sort of the beginning of science as we have begun to understand science.
That's true. It broke the superstitious part of attention to religion, I guess you might say, that had existed before that. And
so how does this relate to this modern era of 1891, or yes, 1891 to the present?
Well, John's thesis involves the threat to civilization that was posed by the World Wars, particularly World War II and the following Cold War, and particularly the potential of a nuclear Armageddon. He feels that living under this, young people were prompted to try new things more daringly, perhaps, than had been the case of some of us who grew up in a different era.
I see.
And that he even ascribes rock music to to this. I think he was a drummer in a rock band himself.
I see. Oh, that's really interesting. So all these these forces are sort of came together and made this area sort of ripe for what's happened since.
Yes.
Now, talked a little bit about the pioneering days of radio engineering, and I know that, for example, Hewlett and Packard were interested in radio engineering. That was one of the reasons why I think they went to Stanford. Was that correct?
Yes. Frederick Terman was the outstanding professor in the country of radio engineering, and he almost went to the MIT faculty, but it happened that while he was home, his father was a professor of psychology at Stanford. While he was home one summer, he contracted tuberculosis and was unable to take this MIT job. So he stayed here while he was recuperating, and pretty soon he had a half-time job on the engineering faculty, and pretty soon he had a full-time job, and before too long he was the dean.
He didn't want to face those cold winters back east.
No, I don't think it was that, but he just decided to stay, and he knew all the people in the peninsula radio and tube companies and so on, and he would take his students around to tour these companies, including Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett in the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
So,
he was also responsible for encouraging them to go into business, wasn't he?
That's true. He did, and he managed to get Dave Packard back from General Electric in Schenectady, New York, by dangling a graduate fellowship, which I've forgotten. It wasn't very much, but I mean, it doesn't seem today to us that it was very much, but it did enable him to come back. And Bill and Dave had talked about forming a company from the time they were seniors in college. So that was just enough to get them going.
That's really something. Now, we've set the stage now in terms of radio engineering, and some of the people like Packard and Hewlett who were attracted to those, and their community. They also the defense industry had something to do with what was about to happen. The building of Moffett Field and NASA Ames, some of the other research centers here.
Yes, that's very true. The defense, World War II, when actually Fred Terman went back to Harvard and ran a big radio laboratory there, opened his eyes and those of some of his outstanding graduates, including not only Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett, but also Edward Ginston, and who was early involved in Berry and Associates for many years. It sort of opened their eyes to the possibilities of big science coming here after the war, and Terman in particular attracted a good deal of that. The HP got a great boost during the early part of the Korean War. They were ready when it broke out, and that caused a big spurt of electronics industry, and they were supplying the measuring instruments to the industry, to other companies in the industry. So that was a period when they doubled and redoubled every year in the space race and the Cold War era. Brought Lockheed in here with Lockheed Missiles and Space Division, and with their research lab, and brought many contracts to other electronics firms and avionics firms and so on.
Oh, that's interesting. So these research centers, the defense industry, and some small fledgling companies sort of got started. But what was the big thrust, do you believe? Was it the transistor with Shockley, or did that all? That's important. An interesting story, isn't it?
Yeah. Before we leave the research labs, maybe I should mention that right after the war, did you ever hear the phrase, prices slightly higher west of the Mississippi?
Yes.
I used to say that about California, and before we became the most populous state and so on. Anyhow, a lot of the Western manufacturers were looking for new fields and looking for ways to improve. And they were in on the founding of Stanford Research Institute, which has now become SRI International. That did a lot of applied research that was adopted by industry and helped get the high-tech fields started. Then later on, we had IBM came in 1952 with its labs in San Jose, and of course they invented the disk storage method there, which has, of course, permeated the whole computer industry.
Right. Don't forget about Xerox.
No, I won't forget Xerox PARC, but even before Xerox PARC, HP had a lab, Lockheed had a lab. They were all good labs. In fact, almost every company has quite a research and development program.
So
but Xerox had a very special one.
Very special one. Well, let's talk about that special
Okay.
one. We'll go back to Shockley because that's the story that we couldn't miss.
All right.
But Xerox PARC is this sort of an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? Especially the computer science group and what has really sort of spawned from that.
Yes. Xerox was founded, I believe, in 1970, Xerox PARC, and they attracted a very fine group of researchers who, many of them had been involved in the early stages of the ARPANET, and but at any rate, before very long, they had stuff there that people on the outside didn't see until about 15 years later. They had personal computers, they had an Ethernet network, they had servers, they had Windows. They
It was all
they had
there.
all this great technology, and yet, as it turned out, the Xerox company, did not commercialize much of any of that. They eventually, these gentlemen got tired of waiting, I guess, and they
Went off on their own.
They went off on their own. Some of them went off to do entirely different things, but actually, in particular, in the case of Adobe, John Warnock and Chuck Geschke, they found that the market conditions were such that what they had been working on at Xerox was very much in demand, and so that's what led Adobe to get going.
And there were many others.
But there were many others.
Others like
Microsoft people took a lot of its programs from there. The Ethernet companies, it was like little sparks going off
everywhere.
everywhere.
Well, let's go back again to Shockley and Fairchild, and I think that's really considered sort of the grandfather of all of Silicon Valley companies.
You know, there was a from a historian's viewpoint, there was a division when the transistor was invented. A few years after that, and Shockley was one of the inventors at Bell Laboratories.
And he won
lived
the
here as
Nobel Prize.
Yes, he did. He and his colleagues. He had lived here as a boy in Palo Alto, and he decided to try to commercialize his invention, which I guess he wasn't getting enough attention at Bell Labs. At any rate, he decided to come out here and establish a semiconductor company. He rounded up about 10 or 12 of the most outstanding young scientists in this area, which included quite a bit of chemistry as well as electronics and so on. So it turned out that Shockley was not cut out to be. He was a great research director. He was very good at choosing a research direction and focusing. So that's what he'd done at Bell Labs. But he hadn't had to run the whole shooting match.
A company he probably didn't have the interest that you need to do
Well,
that.
Dave Packard told me that Shockley didn't know the first thing about running a company, that he used to call Dave up and ask, how do I buy pencils? Where do I hire a secretary? You know, but that wasn't the part
his strength.
That wasn't the part that led to Fairchild. What led to Fairchild was that as I understand it at least, Shockley was he wanted to work on a transistor improvement, whereas these young PhDs who were working for him were looking a little farther ahead. That was part of it. The other part was that whenever they did something, they invented or had found a breakthrough or something, they'd come to him, and one time he kept Bob Noyce standing there while he picked up the phone, called Bell Labs, and checked out this idea with somebody there. It was a certain insensitivity as a boss that ultimately drove them out.
You call them the traitorous eight?
He called them the traitorous eight. He later called them that. They broke away, and they were operating out of their homes in Los Altos and Palo Alto for quite a while, and they were looking for financing. And they finally found some through Fairchild Camera and Instrument in the East, which adopted Fairchild Semiconductor as a division and got them started. And very soon they devised the integrated circuit. And I remember Gordon Moore saying one time that they said, after they'd done that, they said, well, there's the integrated circuit. Now what do we do? But Fairchild...
You know what they started, or they must have realized, or maybe they didn't realize the impact. But
well, I don't think that,
they did
it takes a while
point.
to sink in, maybe.
Yeah.
But they had also developed the planar process of depositing chemicals on, and so they had a lot of inventions there. And when Fairchild hit stride, it was the main company in the semiconductor industry. Even though some of the people they'd hired to run the company took off and
started their own.
Started another company called that didn't last very. No, it was called Ream Semiconductor. That didn't last very long. But Fairchild went on for what, about 10 years, I guess. And the trouble, according to Mike Malone, who's my main source on this, was that the Eastern directors of Fairchild Camera and Instrument did not really understand these guys, didn't understand their motivation or anything. They wouldn't give Noyce, who became was running the outfit, wouldn't allow him to use stock options or any kind of incentive for these people, and it became pretty frustrating for everybody. And gradually, they Charlie Spork took off with a bunch of them to go to National Semiconductor, and that was the beginning of an exodus from Fairchild that really sort of, it was almost like taking the wind out of its sails.
I know, and now we just have this mushrooming in Silicon Valley of all kinds of technologies, not really somewhat related to the semiconductor industry, but coming from a lot of directions. Wanted to ask you in terms of what you feel the future is for Silicon Valley. I know that we think that we're almost saturated now with the technology, that we can't absorb anymore, but it seems like there's another new thrust headed our way, with we're riding the internet and so many other technologies that will probably come from it.
Well, I am not a futurist, so I wouldn't even dare venture a prediction as far as the technology part goes. But we did, in posing the question of whether there really was a renaissance to these 60
founders and
distinguished
CEOs.
Figures that we interviewed, we found that almost all of them agreed that they felt it was a renaissance. And not only that, we would ask them, how long into the future do you think it can carry? And very few took a short-term outlook to that. They figured it would go well on into the next century. It possibly could be a regenerating phenomenon rather than burning out the whatever supplies were involved.
Well, I know that I've heard many people, including my father-in-law, who's almost 94, who is 94 now, almost 95, say that he lived in the most exciting century, and I think he probably is right. But who knows? I mean, the people who will be living in the 21st century might, you know, have even more surprises in store for them.
It may be. Several of them said we're only beginning, and Dave Packard made the observation not about a year ago that most of the developments during the 20th century came out of scientific inventions that were made in the late 19th century. And he felt that some of the recent discoveries dealing with manipulating the interior of the atom and so on would provide the same kind of thrust in the next century. And he foresaw a marvelous world with all kinds of opportunities for people in science and
It's interesting.
technology.
No, of all, I know you didn't do all of the interviewing. You did, you know, mention that to me before the show. That, you know, but I know that Dave Packard was a particular favorite of yours, and you know, why do you think that is? Because he built a billion-dollar company. Was that why he was an important man?
I suppose it was that I got to know him. When I was a young reporter, I covered the Palo Alto School Board, and he was on the board. And I admired his leadership there. He really was responsible for the Palo Alto schools keeping up with the building during the baby boom.
He was very involved in the community, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. And of course, after he was on the school board, in fact, there was a bit of an overlap, but he went on the Stanford Board of Trustees and had a lot to do with the construction of the Stanford Research Park. He worked with Terman in bringing in people to that, and also the shopping center to a lesser extent.
And was he also influential with the Stanford Industrial Park at all, or you don't really know that? Or
Was he?
The industrial park?
Yes, he and Terman would talk to these companies, and they'd sort of throw the visitor back to the other side, you know. And,
oh, interesting. Well, it's just been delightful to have you visit with us tonight, Ward.
Well, I've enjoyed it.
Really, it's been a lot of fun to talk with you, and there's many questions I really didn't even have time to ask you tonight, and I really highly recommend that you find a copy of this. So it's in the local bookstores and in the library. It's called The Making of Silicon Valley, a 100-Year Renaissance. It really put together for me a way to kind of bring a lot of elements that I sort of have heard about or read about, but it really became very, very, very coherent for me, and congratulations on a job well done. And the other interesting part, even though, I mean, it's good PR for the companies that were involved, it gives the public a real, you know, sort of thumbnail sketch of what the companies do. So
one of the purposes.
I'm sorry, we're running out of time.
Okay.
But you can come back and visit us when the videotape is released. So thanks, Ward, for joining us again, and thank you, our viewers, for watching the Los Altos History Show. We'll see you the next time.